Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Thank you for tuning in. As always, let's get straight to the politics of the week. So, to my dismay, just after I uploaded last week's main episode, more news came out about the U.S.-China trade war. I had said what we knew at the time of the recording, which was that tariffs were in the process of being reduced, but it was not clear at that time when and if it would happen. We now know that until August, tariffs on Chinese goods will fall from 145% to 30%, and Chinese tariffs on our own goods will fall from 125% to 10%. Not sure why there's that difference, but that's what was announced. This will obviously come as a relief to global supply chains, and many companies had imports on hold due to tariffs because they would have had to pay more in tariffs and than the object was even worth. And at that point, many companies had said, why bother? So they didn't order. So it appeared until last week we were headed for shortages this summer. And not sure now. There's a gap between now. There's a wave of orders coming in, so I've heard. And there had that gap where nothing was ordered. So I would still think we're going to face some shortages. But hopefully those short-term supply chain issues will be ironed out. That being said, there's still going to be some pressure not to buy from China. It's going to be 4 times less than it was previously. But I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal where they interviewed the executive director at the Port of Los Angeles, where a lot of our goods come from. And they said that they didn't expect a wave of imports. But I've also heard reports that there is going to be a wave of imports. So I don't know. He stated, quote, even at a 30% tariff with a 90-day reprieve, it is not going to dramatically change what we are seeing right now. He also believes that some companies like healthcare and holiday merchandise might restock, but he doesn't expect to see a flood of items onto the market like patio furniture, which is unfortunate for me because that's what I was looking for. He said the simple logic of this thinking is you don't front load at 30%, and I would agree with that. At least it makes sense to me. And my thinking is that if tariffs might fall a bit more when the deal is signed, and so companies might hold off. But I don't know. I've heard, as I said, I've heard reports on CNBC that there is a wave of that is coming. Still, though, uncertainty reigns supreme, and my theory is Trump could renege on this deal at any time, and that would definitely shake up supply chain markets. I don't think he will renege, at least in the short term, because talks are ongoing, but it remains a possibility. Politically, for now, I don't see this impacting the president's approval rating. Many Americans will view this as a problem that he created, which it is. And the confusing thing is, to me, as much in this administration, is that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, that neither side wants to decouple. That's what he said. I thought the whole point of this trade war was to decouple. To me, this gives me the impression that either one, everybody has their own idea of what this is supposed to be about, or two, everyone is making this up as they go along, or option number 3, which is probably the worst, is it's a little bit of both. As for inflation, that's our next topic. Data came out last week that showed that prices rose 0.2% in the month of April and are 2.3% higher than they were in April 2024. The biggest movers, which according to BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, I have that linked down below, that energy services like piped gas rose a whopping 15% from last year, as well as shelter and food away from home. This shows the ongoing pressure in the restaurant industry and the housing market, which a lot of people don't know already, but a lot of people know about that already, but I thought I'd mention that. On the bright side, it did say that energy commodities are down double digits than they were last year, about 10 to 11%, mostly because the price of oil is much lower now than it was a year ago. I believe that the impact of tariffs remains to be seen, and my guess is that commodities like new vehicles, apparel, and food is where we're going to see the most impacts. So far, all of those levels remain well below 2% higher than last year, and prices either rose modestly in April or fell in April. So still good for now. I will leave the report in the description, as I said. So next is tax cuts. Feels that this happens, we talk about this every other week, but I have some news on this, and there are some interesting developments that I think, if implemented, could trouble Democrats in the coming midterms. Trump has stated he would be okay with raising taxes on people making over $400,000 a year, which was Joe Biden's plan. Still don't know if it's individuals or families. That was something that the Biden administration went back and forth on. But Trump said if they had to raise taxes on those making $400,000 or more, that he would be okay with that, whatever that's supposed to mean. And if that's the case, this will take one of the reasons Democrats are opposing the bill. It's not the only reason, but it's one of them. The other one is that of the massive cuts. And what's interesting is Democrats are going to oppose this because of the cuts. Republicans will oppose it because the cuts aren't deep enough. So it's quite interesting. The biggest complaint that they seem to have is the cuts, but the next one is that it lowers taxes on the rich. So they could at least remove one of those issues. And will they get behind it? No, because of the cuts. And the cuts to Medicaid, which I'll get to, would be way too deep for Democrats to accept. According to a poll that was presented by Harry Enton on CNN, 76% of Americans disapprove of major cuts to Medicaid. This includes 95% of Democrats, 79% of independents, and 55% of Republicans. The irony here is that a majority of Americans support cuts to government, and they say that the government is too big, but when it's time to make cuts on something, they can never agree. And I have said I support gradual cuts to Medicaid only because we need to get our fiscal house in order. This is why I'll never be elected to Congress, but that also needs to come with appropriate tax rises on the wealthiest Americans. The other bone of contention is the SALT limit. SALT stands for state and local tax deduction. Basically, if someone owes, say, $30,000 in federal taxes, but they pay $20,000 in state and local taxes, like property and income taxes, they get to deduct that from their federal taxes. I've gone back and forth on this. There are two arguments. One is from Rep. Lalotta of Long Island, Nick Lalotta, who's a Republican in New York, and he states that blue states send a lot of money to the federal government compared to red states, and blue states with higher state taxes tend to have higher taxes, and this is not a subsidy, but instead makes it fair. And that's true, and I would agree with that in principle. However, the other side of the argument, which I kind of lean toward, is that people choose to live in these states, and that is what they accept when they live in these states. Also, higher taxes tend to pay for better services, which is what they benefit from. Not picking on Alabama here, but if you can tell that their taxes tend to be lower when you go to their schools. That's just how it is. Their citizens made a choice. They support lower taxes, even if that means that public services like education are not as well funded as in other states. That is a choice that they made. These are choices that people make. Let me emphasize, choices. So if you live in a blue state, my thinking is that you shouldn't benefit from well-funded services and then have the federal government pay you back because you chose to live in that state. That's a choice that you made. For example, I won't get into this too much since it borders on complaining. I live in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned before, and we have decently high taxes here. It's not as high as New York or New Jersey, for example, but we have property taxes that are pretty high, a 6% sales tax on everything but food and clothing, and we also have a 3.07% income tax. And I think that property taxes shouldn't exist, but that's a story for another time. There really shouldn't be an income and a sales tax. It should be one or the other. That is crazy. Being taxed when you make money and when you spend it on a state level is horrific. Therefore, I plan to leave Pennsylvania, not in the foreseeable future, but don't plan on being here in 10 years. But in the distant future, I will not be here. And our gas tax is also really high. California, it's as high as California, and our roads still suck. If you drive from Pennsylvania into Maryland or Delaware, you can tell when you cross the border because the roads get much worse. And one of my grandparents moved out of Pennsylvania because it was too expensive. The property taxes literally ate her to bits. And that is a choice. We make these choices. Obviously, congressmen can't just tell their constituents that they should move, but that's how I feel. And the SALT tax, in my opinion, probably shouldn't exist. That's the kind of direction that the SALT is not tax, it's a SALT deduction. It probably shouldn't exist, in my opinion. That's my take anyway. As I've said, I go back and forth. The Ways and Means Committee, if I understand from media reports, spent 18 hours debating this. That's an insanely long time. And remember, these people are not spring chickens. They're not in their 20s and 30s. Some of them are middle-aged, yes. But some of them are in their 70s and 80s. I don't think anyone in the House is in their 90s, but some of them are pretty close. But that's a story for another time. Another angle politically, as I've talked about earlier, is Medicaid. So Medicaid, I've talked about this before, and I want to issue a correction. I've said that the goal was to cut $800 billion a year from Medicaid. I always thought that was impossible because that's about the whole budget. I was wrong, and this is supposed to be $80 billion per year for 10 years. It's very confusing because media and politicians go back and forth talking about billions versus, or they talk about years versus decade, and I really think it should just be per year because that's how we pay for things every year, not every 10 years. And they were able to find $910 billion in cuts, so that'd be $91 billion a year. And as I've talked about, that $91 billion is so unpopular. And the irony here is that Republicans' base is the working class, and they tend to rely on Medicaid more. Sure, Democrats use it too, but Trump did very well in lower educated and poorer people among them, and I think that's a crazy plan to cut that. Politically, it makes no sense. It's popular on no side of the aisle. So will they make their cuts? Based on the politics and just the numbers in Congress, I would say no, this is not going to happen. But at the same time, not cutting taxes would have the effect of raising taxes. And that would be so unpopular and a huge humiliation for the president, akin to failing to repeal and replace Obamacare. That was something that the Trump administration, probably the biggest failure other than COVID, of the first Trump term. They worked on it for months, and it came down to John McCain's no vote. So both are bad. Passing the tax cuts will be bad for them in the country, but not passing it will also be bad for them. So it seems like a lose-lose situation. Therefore, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic that this bill will ever pass because it takes just 3 Republicans to sink it. If it gets no Democrat support, and Democrats are not going to support this. And that's just in the House. The Senate is a whole nother ballgame. Also, I don't want to forget that one of the president's big plans was to end tax on tips, which is foolish because most people on tips don't pay income tax anyway. But there's a provision to have it sunset in the year 2028, so in the dying weeks of Trump's second term. Democrats should support that. If it was separate, they would support it because Kamala Harris, had she been elected president, would have done the same thing. It's one of the few policies she actually had. The plan, according to Speaker Johnson, is to get this bill passed by Memorial Day, which is a week from today. And that's a tall order, and I don't think it's doable now. Maybe he can pull something out of a hat, but the final bill, I believe House rules require a final bill to be presented 3 days before it's voted. So if they're going to pass it by the time they leave town on Thursday night, they need to show this bill today. And as of the recording of this, which is Sunday, the May 18th, the day before you're listening to this, there's been no final bill. So I don't think this is going to happen. And if they do break the rules and they present it and then try to vote on it right away, that might endanger Johnson's speakership because that's something hardline Republicans require. They said, we want to be able to read the bill before we pass it, which is totally understandable. And without getting too much into it, Democrats are not going to support Johnson again. So he has to present it give 3 days, otherwise his speakership could come to an end. Then the Senate is going to pass it, and the House is not, who will have to pass it. The House is not going to come back until the first week in June because they're off for Memorial Day. Congress, they spend a huge amount of time not working. So the Senate will have to pass it, and they could in about mid-June, but they would have their own qualms about it, as I kind of alluded to earlier. I'll have to cover that once we get there, if we even ever get there. And basically, as I've said before, I don't think they can pass this before they go on their August recess. They spend the whole month of August off. They'll be in until about late July, and then they'll be gone. And it seems like they might be able to get this done in September, but they also have to consider government funding in September. And the president has other things that he probably wants to work on. So this is taking up a huge amount of time. And they'll have to pass another government funding bill in September, as I've said. What is even more telling, and a sign not to do this, as if we needed any more, is that Moody's has downgraded the U.S. credit rating from perfect to a notch below perfect. Big deal? Question mark? Yes and no. It's a big deal because until 2011, all 3 major credit agencies said our credit was AAA rating. In 2011, the S&P downgraded it. In 2023, Fitch downgraded it, and then Moody's was the last holdout, and they downgraded it last week. It's a big deal because it shows that America is becoming increasingly less and less likely to pay back our massive debt pile, and the interest rates keep rising. On the other hand, it's only a slight downgrade, and the previous downgrades have not caused market turmoil, so this might not be a huge deal. So what does a reduced credit rating mean? Well, just like a credit score, the lower your score, the higher the interest payments in general. If I understand correctly, the reason we were downgraded in 2011 and 2023 was that because politicians, mostly Republicans, during the Obama and Biden administrations flirted with defaulting on the debt. And this time, Moody's cites, as I said, the growing debt pile and rising interest rates. Moody's stated, quote, successive U.S. administrations and Congress have failed to agree on measures to reverse the trend of large annual fiscal deficits and growing interest costs, unquote. I totally agree. However, the Trump administration, the Secretary Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, disagrees. Big shock. He says the Biden administration's spending caused this, and in a way that is true, because we currently live under Biden's last budget. We still live under it. Even though it was extended by Trump, we still live under it for the most part. And it was the most expensive than, I think, even the pandemic. We spent more money on than we did during COVID. And Trump was also in office, though, 4 years before that. And so they both raised our national debt substantially. We were at 17 trillion 8 years ago today. And now we're at 34, so it's doubled. And that was only 8 years ago. And the tax cuts then really did rise the deficit by about 2 trillion. It rose the debt by about 2 trillion. Debt is the total debt pile, deficit being each year how much we're in the hole. So it rose it. It added 1.9 trillion to the debt, and COVID obviously added a lot of that too. I'll have to talk about this in another episode. I did watch this report. I think it was by CBS, and they said that had we stayed on the pre-2000 spending and tax cuts, we could have had our national debt paid off by now. Of course, we had the recession and COVID, but we could have had a much lower debt had we not done the Bush tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, the Obama tax cuts. Had we not done all that, then we might be in a much better fiscal situation than we are now. And really, if we don't have it past the appropriate spending cuts, then we could actually see a run on the dollar. That's what I'm concerned about, a run on the Treasury. Hopefully not, but that's something that I remain concerned about. Anyway, hopefully next episode is a bit more positive. I think next episode I'm going to be talking about the revelations about President Biden and his health, that the media has just figured out his health was in the toilet, even though we all knew that. It took them a while. So that's probably going to be a topic of next week's episode, as well as the tax cuts. We'll keep going on that. Anyway, thank you for listening, and as always, see you next week. Bye-bye.